Hi, I'm Marcus James Dixon with Gold Derby, and we are here with Josh Singer, who co-wrote the Netflix movie Maestro with director, producer, actor Bradley Cooper. Josh, you've been around this awards derby before. You won an Oscar for co-writing Spotlight in 2016. How does this year feel different for Maestro?
Hmm. Um, you know, the year, it always feels a little similar, I would say, the circus, as
Hmm.
it were. Um, I guess, there are some things that are somewhat odd, like the WGA, is not really going to participate until later on. Um, but, I think less about the campaigns and more about the work.
Yeah.
And what I would say is that actually, what's remarkable is how lucky I've been to work with incredible directors. Tommy McCarthy, Damien Chazelle, Steven Spielberg, and Bradley, are all wonderful, and they all share certain things in common. I think Bradley has the same sort of uncompromising passion that Tommy had
Mm.
when I worked with him and still has. We're noodling on something new right now. And I think that sort of uncompromising passion is the only thing that you could see something through for the last, 5 years. I think he has the same work ethic as Damien. Damien, who, I used to make a joke that at the end of the day, working with Tommy, I would, we'd have a drink. And at the end of the day, after working with Steven, maybe we'd have a cigar. At the end of the day, after working with Damien, we'd just do some more work. And that's sort of the way it is with Bradley. Bradley has that same uncompromising work ethic. And then in terms of Steven, I think Bradley and Steven share, clear vision, right? I mean, Steven has such great vision that would enable him to, keep going for 90 plus days in the middle of water where he's not getting the material. And, lo and behold, he comes up with Jaws, right? Like, and I think the same thing with Bradley. Like, it's funny because, like, I feel like some of what he said about, about working for 5, 6 years has been twisted in odd ways. And I think all he's really meant by it is, he likes to go deep. He
Mm.
likes to go deep and he likes to work hard and he likes to get it right, which is very much how I like to work. All of my projects have been long term. All of my projects, all the ones I've mentioned, except for the post, because we were on a pretty rapid schedule, but certainly First Man, Spotlight, and this, hundreds of drafts,
Mm.
hundreds and hundreds of drafts, of scripts. And that's sort of how it goes. Like, you're pushing and you're pushing and you're pushing, you're trying this and you're trying that, and then you're taking a step away, which gives you some objectivity, and then you're coming back. And you can only do that if you have intense passion and long-term vision,
Mm.
which is something I think Bradley has in spades, and it's why I think his work is so deep and so powerful.
Mm. I'm looking at your poster for the post behind you. That was my favorite movie of that year, by the way.
Oh,
But
that's very kind. That's
back to
very
Maestro, yes. So
How
Maestro
great was
told,
Meryl in that? I mean, I
I
thought,
know.
look, Meryl got nominated, but I thought it was one of her most incredible performances. There's this moment
Yeah.
where she's making a decision and the camera is swirling around her, and it's one of the most extraordinary acting moments I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And I remember it on the day and like losing my mind, and then it had even more power in the moment. And I think there's something actually Meryl and Bradley share in common, which is that Meryl, when she was on set, it was the funniest thing because I thought Hanks was doing great, great work. And Meryl, like, she was making all of these choices that I thought were a little odd. Like there
Hmm.
was a choice she threw out a line in an early scene. I'm like, no, she's not. That character isn't there yet. And I was really struggling to the extent that like a couple of my friends were like, you're worried about Meryl Streep's performance? I was like, I am. And the moment, and it's amazing because Steven, the crazy thing about Steven is like 7 days after you're done shooting, he has a cut. And when I say he's a cut, it's not an assembly, it's a real cut because he's been cutting all the way along, right? He's been cutting scenes as he goes. So literally like 7 or 8 days, I go to his editing room to see the cut, which is pretty close to the finished film and is extraordinary. And I start screaming at the screen when I'm done, Meryl Streep, look at Meryl Streep. And it's because all those little things that I thought were incorrect were actually incredibly correct. And she had
Mhm.
understood that character arc better than I had. And she had known, like, oh, I can do this little thing here, right? That is going to pay off here, even if it's not exactly where you had pitched the character, because it's all part of the same three-dimensional human. And I
Mhm.
think, frankly, in watching how Bradley, would play on set, and play with what was there, right? It was a similar thing where I didn't always understand the choices, from an acting point of view and really from a directing point of view. But once I saw the whole thing put together, I was like, oh, this is genius. Right?
Mhm.
He's got that sort of preternatural sense of where he is at all time and where he's going, right? Which I think only the very, 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 very best actors have, right? And similarly, the best directors.
And Maestro tells the story of American composer Leonard Bernstein from ages 25 to 71. And I'm just curious, how much did you personally know about Leonard before this project? He passed away in 1990, but I know there's a ton of documented records from decades ago that you guys poured through.
I knew almost nothing. It's funny because I had a buddy in college, this wonderful guy named George Steele, who had been a protege of Lenny's. Lenny had written him a recommendation for college saying, "I like his music," right, which is
Mhm.
about the best recommendation you can get from Leonard Bernstein. And so I'd heard a couple things, but not much. I knew West Side Story, but not much beyond that. And I the reason I got pulled into it is because Fred Berner and Amy Durning, who are our first producers, had read my spec script. I'd written a spec script which started my work on the feature side about George Gershwin writing Porgy and Bess.
Mm.
And so I suppose I have a yen for great dead Jewish composers. And and they said, "Hey, would you be interested in Bernstein?" I said, "Well, I don't know much, but let me look into it." And I was immediately fascinated with him as an individual. And I started inhaling his music. And I will say, one of the greatest joys of the last 10 years has been the odyssey of getting to know his music. Which it's one of the things I'm incredibly proud of. At Script, we played with all sorts of different, our playlist kept evolving and changing, and it continued to evolve and change through post. But I think that playlist, which is now on Spotify, is extraordinary. And it's extraordinary because the music is all of a piece, because it's all Lenny's and it all feels connected. And yet it's from all different parts of his life. And you'll find things in there, like there's the prologue from West Side Story, which is very familiar. And some people might be familiar with New York, New York, which is in there, and maybe even Fancy Free, but I'm sure very few people know Facsimile, which is this lovely psychosexual ballet he did with Jerry Robbins in the late 40s, which starts with this haunting clarinet, or Age of Anxiety's Second Symphony, which is also a haunting clarinet. By the way, of course, David Oppenheim played clarinet. So if you want to know what haunting clarinet means to Lenny, just watch the movie and look at his relationship with Oppenheim. But like, I feel like the music is so strong and it's like its own character in the piece. And that's something, not only am I proud of the work we did at Script, but then, Bradley was always incredibly committed to bringing Lenny's music to the fore, bringing Mahler to the fore, bringing classical music to the fore. And that's been kind of a wonder.
And this is more of a love story than most of your other projects have been. And I'm curious, what is something you learned about Leonard and Felicia, played by the amazing Carey Mulligan, that surprised you the most?
She is amazing, isn't she? I mean,
Yeah.
she's just as advertised. Like, you can't ask for a better actor to begin with, and then she's just such a wonderful human. And the work, for me, it's the best performance this year by far. Not even a question. Look, I would say what's interesting to me is when I started, it was always clear to me that Felicia had grounded Lenny. But I was terrified of going into the later years, the years when they'd struggled. And so, what I focused my initial scripts on before Bradley got involved were Lenny's struggle with, whether to conduct or compose, the first sort of the beginning of his life, literally up till when he turned 40, sort of his ascent, if you will. In which what's amazing is, and we show this in the film, when Felicia comes along, she really grounds him. And whereas Kusevitsky has pushed him only to conduct and only to focus on classical music, something about being with her allows him to expand. And in the 50s, he has this, he blooms, right? He writes Wonderful Town, he writes Candide, he writes West Side Story, he does Omnibus, he does young people's concerts, and he eventually takes over the New York Philharmonic. It's this incredible story of how her love grounds him. And that's what I was focused on, was his debate and then how that love eventually grounds him. But Felicia was definitely the B story, if you will. And
Mm.
Bradley came along and he was like, no, 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 this is not what we should be doing. And we actually focused. I'm going to see if I have my copy here. I know I have it nearby. It's under the piles and piles. There's this wonderful book called The Private World of Leonard Bernstein, which when Bradley came on board, he immediately gravitated to. And it was this funny thing because, like, the first thing I started hearing when Bradley came on board was page one rewrite, which was terrifying as a writer, because I thought I was going to be out the window as well. But Bradley fortunately wanted to work with me, knew I'd done a bunch of research. But instead of focusing on the Burton biography, which is what I have right here by my desk, that's the one I got open right now. Um, he gravitated to this book, The Private World of Leonard Bernstein, which was this wonderful picture book with these great photos of Lenny and his family. John Gruen went with Lenny to Italy in 1967 when Lenny was 50 and was stepping down from the Philharmonic and a little bit struggling, midlife crisis. Had this wonderful family, but there were cracks beginning to show. Felicia was happy but unhappy, and there actually, in fact, are whole monologues from that interviews which we use for the movie. There's a wonderful interview we have with Lenny doing with John Gruen, not in Italy but in Fairfield, played by wonderfully by Josh Hamilton. And then there's another piece on the grass where in Fairfield where Sarah Silverman is talking with Carrie about the challenge of being in Lenny's orbit. And that's
Mm.
also taken right from that book. And that book, I think for Bradley, really, it became a focus because he was like, this family is so fascinating. And the idea of queer men having a family, and it's not a beard, right? It's not fake. It's a real love and a real family and a real need. There's a real need for family there. In fact, when Lenny left Felicia with Tom Cawthon, which we depict in the film, it lasted all of 3 months. And then he was like, I got to come back. I can't live without her. Right.
Mm.
Um, that was he literally left in the fall of 70, December of 76 and was back by February, like it's kind of extraordinary. And so Bradley just got consumed with that lens, and it became clear that was going to be our A story.
Mhm.
And what I would say is, for me, what I've learned, my scripts that I was playing with were very clever and very factual and had lots of neat little chestnuts about Lenny, but they didn't have real heart and emotion, right? And as soon as Bradley and I started working, I realized, like, oh, that focus on heart and emotion, which I think is a sinecure of Bradley's work. Like, to me, that it was a real education in terms of, oh, this is what you should be leading with, because this is what draws an audience in and makes it universal, as opposed to just a specific little story about this, great Jewish composer conductor that nobody quite remembers,
Mhm.
if that
You
makes sense.
mentioned you mentioned his kids and how, the family is so fascinating. And I'm remembering back during the strikes, his children were out there kind of campaigning for the movie because no one else could. And I'm curious, did they give you any input? Were you able to
A
talk to the
ton.
children?
A
Yeah.
ton. So when I first started 10 years ago, I sat with the children, which was terrific because, like, they are so fun and delightful and funny. And I have a list of Jewish jokes with Jamie wanted to publish along with her book Famous Father Girl, which was very helpful, by the way. That joke list is fantastic, and I pull it out and use it on occasion. But they're terrific, and not only were they terrific, but they introduced us to wonderful people. They introduced me to Ellen Adler back then, who's in the film. I spoke to her and her daughter. She eventually married David Oppenheim. But, as her daughter said, Lenny's joke was, I slept with both your parents. And so we use that in the script.
Yeah.
You can't come up with a better line than that. They introduced us to, they put me in touch with Steve Sondheim. I got to spend 2 hours talking to Sondheim about Lenny, which was incredibly valuable. And then when Bradley came on board, they continued to do that. They put him in touch with Cynthia O'Neill, who, gave him the line, never get another perm, which is what Alicia said when Cynthia O'Neill comes out to visit her when she's sick, which is a tremendous line, and all sorts of stories. And then beyond that, Bradley then wound up leaning on them quite heavily. He sent them multiple drafts of our scripts, which they gave notes on. Well, they weren't on set because Bradley has a very close set. He had them watch multiple cuts through post. They gave him notes all through post. Sometimes those notes were challenging. They are tough customers. But I will say one of the amazing things for me was, there was this point where, because Fred and Amy had the rights since 2010. There was this point in 2018 where I had been working on the script with Steven for about 6 months, but we couldn't tell them that because Steven was also working on West Side Story. And the rights were up for renewal, and Jake Gyllenhaal had been sort of whispering in their ears. And so we were like, well, we better send the script. We can't tell them about Steven's involvement. We'll send the script. And I was like, oh, the script's great. Steven loves it. I'm sure they'll just say, oh, yeah, keep going. They didn't like the script.
Mm.
And it wasn't until Bradley got involved and showed them his vision that they agreed to re-up with us. And then, it's been well publicized how much they love the movie. And I think, if the movie were not to their liking, they would not be there, right? They are tough customers. And to me, watching that movement was humbling, and then also pretty rewarding, because like at the end of the day, well, you don't want to pander to the real life subjects. You do want them to feel like this is an accurate representation. And I think they very much do. And that's sort of, in some ways, that's the audience. That's the first audience you're playing for.
And by the way, did we ever find out who left Snoopy in the vestibule? And
You'd have to ask Bradley. I'm not sure. I think it might have been Alexander, but I'm not entirely sure there. But that moment, in Jamie's book, she describes a big fight during Thanksgiving with Snoopy passing by out the window. And to speak again to Bradley's vision, he read that and he was like, "We got to do that." And I was like, "Okay." I didn't get it, right? I didn't see it. I was like, well, we need a big fight there. Like that is definitely we need a big fight, towards the end of the second act to sort of get under what's been going on. But the Snoopy thing, I was like, yeah, whatever, right? And but he just wouldn't let it go, and he wouldn't let it go, and he wouldn't let it go, and has to be in Dakota, has to be. I was like, could we put it over? No, I've got to see. It's got to be Snoopy. And then, of course, when I saw the final, when I saw the, because it wasn't final for a while, so I saw the fight a number of times before the VFX was in there, and the fight I knew was great. But then when you see the Snoopy VFX, you're like, oh wow! And that's, again, it speaks to vision, right? Which I think Bradley has just in spades.
And Netflix actually sent Snoopy's to voters and to members of the press. I have mine here
You're
behind me
kidding!
watching. I
I
hope
didn't get a Snoopy.
you
I
didn't
want a
get one.
Snoopy. I
No,
gotta complain.
yeah, or I'll send you mine after this. But last question, I'm very curious. You're an Oscar voter, I'm assuming
I am.
you are. So when you're filling out your ballot, what kind of things do you look for in a script? What impresses you when you're voting?
It's interesting because, like, I feel like that there are a number of movies that have been quite lauded this year that I feel like the scripts are not. I feel like the scripts are not, you know, uh, I will say, for me, a great script is sort of a circle, right? It starts in a certain place, and by the time you're at the end, you're sort of coming full circle and sort of speaking to the beginning again in this really powerful way. And you see it with us where you literally start with him in that it's taken from Mike Wallace interview speaking about Felicia, and then you go on this journey, because to me the question is, he's speaking about Felicia, and then you see this naked man he's in bed with, and you're like, well, what gives, right? And it's the fundamental question of, what was this marriage, and was it a real marriage? And then you come to the end and you see that he's still even though he's gone on and is teaching and partying and all that, he's still sort of lost without her, which Lenny really was, the last, 12 years of his life, just a real rugged spiral of drugs and carousing. And he was just, many people have said he wasn't the same man. And so that's the answer. The answer is, we pose the question, we bring it back to the answer. And there
Mm,
are some movies, American Fiction to me is a great one. Like I really love that script,
mm,
the way sort of it's all on the same theme in a pretty clear way.
mm,
I would say Past Lives, it's slightly less ambitious perhaps, but it is very clear what it is, and it's beautiful, beautifully rendered, beautifully written. Like, these are scripts that to me are quite strong. And that's, but ultimately, like, and I think this is where Bradley's got it right. Like, it's got to move you, right? It's got to move you. It's got to make you invested. And when I look back to my first script of Maestro, it didn't quite do those things, right? And it wouldn't have made my list. Certainly not now, right?
mhm.
Whereas I'd like to think our film and our script does that now. Of course, it'll be for others to decide. But I don't know. Is that a fair answer? I don't really.
Yeah, I love that. And you're up at the Critics' Choice Awards this weekend, so best of luck.
Thank you.
And Oscars are coming up. And as you said, WGA Awards will be a
Yeah,
little bit later, but they're coming down the line. So thank you so much for chatting with us today.
I appreciate it. Take care. Good to chat, Marcus.